In the glinting corridors of Tudor power, where courtiers clawed their way towards royal favour and heads could roll faster than an archbishop's tongue, one of the most envied positions in the palace wasn't a general, a bishop, or even a chancellor, no. It was the man who wiped the king's royal bottom. Welcome to the world of the Groom of the Stool, or perhaps the most shockingly influential job title in English history. At first glance, the role sounds absurd, comedic even, a noble man stooping to help Henry VIII relieve himself. Surely this was some strange medieval prank or a cautionary tale about courtly humiliation, but no. The Groom of the Stool was a man of rare and dangerous intimacy. He saw the king naked. Physically, yes, but also emotionally, politically, and financially. He was the king's whisperer, his wallet keeper, and sometimes the only soul in England who could speak freely to the most powerful man in Christendom, whilst he had his codpiece off. This video plunges into the velvet-draped, lavender-scented, and surprisingly political world of the Tudor toilet. We'll follow the Groom of the Stool through a typical day, not just to the privy, but to the corridors of power, where his influence could make or break careers, and where a wrong word might just cost him more than his job. The Groom of the Stool's origins lie in the slightly less glamorous bowels of medieval royal housekeeping. In the 15th century, the stool in question wasn't just an euphemism. It was a literal piece of furniture, a finely carved wooden commode, complete with a padded seat and a chamber pot hidden beneath it. The groom's job was simple: make sure the king could do his business in peace, comfort, and luxury. He prepared cloths, warm water, and perfumes. He cleaned, dried, and then discreetly disappeared. But under Henry VIII, the role bloomed into something far more complex. The transformation began with the creation of the Privy Chamber, a private inner sanctum of the royal household, staffed by men personally chosen by the king. And these weren't just servants. They were loyal companions, hunting partners, and confidants. The Groom of the Stool, by virtue of his daily attendance, sat at the very centre of the inner circle. When you help the king wipe, you gain access no other courtier dares dream of. From this humble seat, the groom could hear the king's uncensored thoughts, manage his personal finances, and control access to his presence. In a world where who got to speak to the king decided the fate of families, this was a throne of dangerous opportunity. The Groom of the Stool's day began early, often before the sun peeked over the red brick towers of Hampton Court. While the court was still yawning in their feather beds, he was already in motion, preparing the king's private chambers. Clean linen, scented water, embroidered towels, the ceremonial shaving bowl, and the all-important close stool, lined with velvet and discreetly tucked into a corner of the privy chamber. Only the groom was permitted to assist the king in his morning routine. As the candles flickered against tapestries and the air filled with the musk of roses and rosemary, Henry VIII, no stranger to vanity, might complain about an ulcer on his leg, fret over his weight, or just as easily rail against a disloyal wife. This was no ordinary toiletry task. These were the unfiltered murmurs of a monarch in his undergarments. Sir William Compton, one of the earliest and most favoured grooms, knew this better than anyone. Having grown up with Henry, he became the king's man in every sense, handling his gambling debts, setting up romantic liaisons, even riding alongside him at jousts. And then there was Sir Henry Norris, another beloved groom who paid the ultimate price for being too close, accused of treason and alleged adultery with Anne Boleyn, and he lost his head in 1536. In the Tudor court, proximity to the king was as dangerous as it was desirable. As the court stirred and the palace filled with the rustles of silk and the murmur of ambition, the Groom of the Stool shifted roles from bathroom attendant to political bouncer. He stood, often quite literally, between the king and the rest of the world, Ministers, ambassadors, bishops, petitioners all had to pass through the groom's invisible gate. Access meant influence, and influence meant power. If the groom favoured you, you might find yourself summoned to a private audience. If he didn't, your words might never reach the king's ears. By this time of day, the groom was also managing royal clothing, jewellery, and even personal correspondence. In fact, he often helped read, summarise, or deliver important documents, and during Henry's later years, this administrative side grew even more pronounced. Sir Anthony Denny, who held the position in 1540s, virtually ran the king's household and managed his signature, a tremendous responsibility. He controlled who could see Henry and what they could say, and even, in the end, who would be with him as he died. The groom was also in charge of the king's spending, and the Eltham Ordinances of 1526 laid out expectations for financial oversight, especially concerning wardrobes, gifts and furniture. Essentially, the groom became the king's personal accountant and had to know not just the cost of a banquet, but whether it was politically wise to even host one in the first place. Now, by the afternoon, to the untrained eye, the Groom of the Stool may have seemed like a glorified valet, but behind the scenes court politics swirled. Noble families fought tooth and nail to get one of their own into the position. Gifts were offered, alliances forged, and whispers were traded. The reason? The groom was always in the king's confidence, and that meant opportunities, titles, estates, marriages, and influence. Being named Groom of the Stool was the courtier's equivalent of holding the keys to the nuclear codes. Except the king was the bomb, and you were tasked with calming it. The groom had to be discreet, clever, and always aware of the ever-shifting winds of royal mood. A single misstep, a poorly timed joke, or the whiff of betrayal could mean ruin, or worse. Now, the Groom of the Stool lived in comfort, though not too extravagant. He was close to the king. In great palaces like Whitehall and Greenwich, his chambers were located near the king's private apartments, often within the labyrinth suites of the Privy Chamber. These lodgings reflected his elevated status: carved beds, fine linen, a writing desk, and sometimes a private servant of his own. Not quite regal, but a far cry from the Spartan quarters of a low-born gentleman. He had to be within earshot of a summons at any hour, and he usually was. The groom wasn't just on call, he was ever present. Now, as twilight settled over the Thames and the scent of roasting meat drifted from the palace kitchens, the groom assisted the king into bed. The work was gentle and precise: unfasten the heavy barcade, soothe sore joints, bandage wounds, especially Henry's infamous leg ulcer, and ensure the room was silent and secure. It was in these quiet hours that the king might let slip his deepest fears of ageing, of betrayal, or of death. Few men in England ever heard these admissions. Fewer still were trusted with them. And when death finally came knocking, it was Anthony Denny, not a bishop, not a lord, but the Groom of the Stool, who told the king that his end was near. He comforted him, he shielded him from scheming courtiers, he carried out his final wishes, he closed the door on Henry's reign. So what was the Groom of the Stool? A glorified valet, a medieval butler, or something far more dangerous? He was, in truth, a mirror of the Tudor court itself, strange, splendid, intimate, and always teetering on the edges of disaster. Through his access to the king's most private moments, he wielded influence no general could dream of. He controlled the doors to power, to pleasure, and eventually to legacy. In the end, the groom's power didn't come from bloodline or battlefield, but from his nearness to the body of the king. And in the strange world of Henry VIII's England, that made him one of the most powerful and most precariously perched men in the whole realm. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.